This episode of True Crime Conversations contains discussions of alleged child abuse, abduction, murder, and the recounting of traumatic events. Listener discretion is advised. It was Australia Day 1966 when Nancy Beaumont was awoken by two of her children, 7-year-old Arnna and 4-year-old Grant, jumping on her bed. As the temperature climbed into the 40s, they begged their mum to go to the beach. There were only a few days left of school holidays, and the Beaumont children wanted to make the most of it. They lived only 2.5 kilometres or so from Glenelg Beach near Adelaide, South Australia. The cool water and surrounding sprinklers were a respite from the almost unbearable heat of summer. The beach was just about their favourite place in the world. 9-year-old Jane, the eldest, was put in charge of taking her younger brother and sister to the beach up the road and ensuring they were all back by lunchtime. Nancy walked her 3 children up the road to the bus stop and placed some money in Jane's hand, instructing her to bring home some lunch. She farewelled them, sure she'd see them again in just a few hours. She never did, though. Apart from a few critical sightings at the beach, no one would ever see the 3 Beaumont children again. I'm Jessie Stevens, and this is True Crime Conversations, exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. In this episode, I'm talking to Stuart Mullins, co-author of the book The Saturn Man, uncovering the mystery of the missing Beaumont children. Stuart is more than a researcher. He grew up only streets away from the 3 Beaumont children. He is also working on a new book, due for release early next year. Stuart believes wholeheartedly that he knows exactly what happened to Jane, Arnna and Grant on that fateful day in 1966. It was January 26, 1966, when Nancy Beaumont kissed her 3 kids goodbye at the bus stop as they set off to go to the beach. The eldest, Jane, was 9. I wanted to ask you, was that unusual for her to sort of be in charge of a 7-year-old and a 4-year-old sibling as they went to the beach?
No, this was usual back in the 1960s. I can tell you firsthand. I was born in Glenelg. I was the same age as Arnna, and I lived about 3.5 kilometres up the road. Children had the responsibility. We went on buses. We walked to the beach, which was kilometres. We rode our bikes pretty well anywhere, as long as you were home before the street lights came on. That was the mother's rule, which went right throughout the 1950s and 1960s. And for me personally, I was 7 years old at the time. I took the bus to Glenelg. I took the bus to the Glenelg by myself. This was not unusual. So what Jane was doing was what other families were doing.
And what can you tell us about the Beaumont family? So there were 3 kids and the parents, the father worked and the mother was at home. What do we know about what kind of people they were?
I've spoken to Jane's best friend who sat with her at school. She knew Jane for around 4 years. They were nearly inseparable. She described the children as latchkey, meaning that Jane was more of a parentified child, as most of us were. Mr. Beaumont was a travelling salesman for Lincott's linen industry that took him out to the countryside. He wasn't happy that he was away from the children, but the money he earned paid the mortgage. Mrs. Beaumont was a stay-at-home mum, but she was, as this friend said, she wasn't there. She was usually at friends' places or away. This friend said that she had never seen Mr. and Mrs. Beaumont at home. It was Jane looking after Grant, looking after Arnna. But again, it is not unusual. I came from a family of 6. I just lived up the road. I very rarely saw Mum and Dad until the evening. We were out all day at the school holidays. That's what we did. And then we returned for dinner. So Jane's and Arnna and Grant's childhood was exactly the same. The beaches were very close by. There was Somerton Beach, Brighton Beach, and the very, very popular Glenelg Beach. That's where we spent most of our time, either Brighton, which had the jetty, or Glenelg, Collie Reserve, and we would spend all day there. And Jane was the mother hen. She was very mature for her age. She loved reading. She would go through several books per month, and so she was very avid, very learned. She was nearly top of her class and very independent.
So that was during the school holidays, and they've jumped on the bus in the morning, and they were expected home at around midday, weren't they?
That's correct. They took the bus roughly about 9:45, 10 o'clock. It was a very hot day. It was going to reach 100 degrees Fahrenheit in days terms, around 42, 43 degrees Celsius. And in South Australia, most of South Australia is a desert. So you've got this strong northerly wind coming down from the desert. And so your only respite is either the Adelaide Hills, adventuring the streams or the Torrens River, or you would go down the beach. Obviously, this day, the children wanted to go down the beach. Their friends were down there, and it was the last day or last few days of the school holidays. So you would catch the bus. Usually Jane, Arnna and Grant would walk to the beach. It was only 2.5 kilometres from their place at Somerton Park. Because it was so hot, Grant wasn't wearing a T-shirt. They said, "We'll take the bus and I'll let you go to the beach as long as you're home by lunchtime, and here's some money for the bus ride and some pies and some cakes and some fizzy drink for us to bring home."
So what did Nancy do when she's waiting for the kids at 12 and they don't come? What was her next move?
I think as all parents, you are always worried about your children once they go, especially if they don't come back on time. These days you're frantically on your iPhone. You'll be texting them or calling them. With Mrs. Beaumont, they didn't come home on the 12 o'clock bus. Her natural reaction was, okay, well, they've missed that bus, they're on the next one. Now, the next one came within about 40 minutes, maybe a bit longer. When they weren't on that bus, that's when she got worried. That's where the motherly instinct kicks in. She spoke to a friend. A friend, of course, said, look, they've just missed the bus. They might be walking home, but Nancy didn't want to follow the usual path they take. Just in case they did come back by a bus, they alighted, got home, and she was out there looking for them. But the next bus, it was that next one that really set the alarms off. They weren't on the next bus. This was completely unusual. Where were they? That's when she became very frantic, and that was around 2 o'clock. So you can imagine, as parents, if you've got children, then 2 hours and they're still not home.
And Jim unexpectedly came home, didn't he? He was meant to be away and then he turned up.
He was away. He left very early in the morning. He was working for Lincott Linen, and he was servicing country towns of South Australia. He was out near Snowtown, and he did come back early that day, and he could see that his wife was very distraught because it was around 3-4 o'clock and they still had not returned. So, of course, Jim and Nancy got in the car and went around the streets looking for them, but, of course, couldn't find them.
Both of them were living in hope that the children had overstayed their stay at the beach, or that they'd gone to their friends' places and stayed there to play. And they were still living in that hope that everything was all right. Because naturally, as time went on, they became more and more concerned, and that was the situation.
And so when they decided to eventually contact police, what was the first response of the police force?
Mr. and Mrs. Beaumont went to the Glenelg police station in the late afternoon. They met the detective constable on duty that day, which was Mostyn Matters. Mostyn is, in fact, my cousin. He recollects that day very vividly. In fact, he'll never forget it. They were very distraught. They reported that their children were missing. Now, the detectives at the station would tell them that, look, they will turn up soon. Like, they could be hiding, they could have done this or could have done that. They weren't put down as missing children. Now, this is not unusual in 1966. It was always, they'll turn up soon. The abduction of 3 children had never happened before and never happened since, not just in Australia but around the world. The idea of abduction never entered anybody's mind. This did not happen.
And it had only been a few hours at that point. So what did they think had happened? What did they say to the parents?
The first thing Mostyn said was, don't worry, they will turn up soon. We'll put a call out to the police vehicle because they had a 2-way radio just to have a look around for them. Mr. Beaumont, again, got in his car and looked around for them. But as the time ticked on, 30 minutes and then an hour, that was when the alarm bells started to ring. Even for Mostyn, Madison, the team, they had a problem. These children weren't home. They said, look, they could be hiding at your house, which was highly unlikely. They could still be playing down the sandhills. They could be at another friend's place. But Mr. and Mrs. Beaumont were very, disbelieving of that because it was their own children. It got to about 5 o'clock and that's when panic stations set in.
And so did police sort of speak to people on the beach and see if anyone had sighted the children?
Well, once the call came out and the children were termed missing, it did hit the papers. But to see the papers, you had the evening paper, it was too late for that. So it only hit the papers, the advertiser, in the next morning. So it was only radio and TV. TV news bulletins would come on, but not too many people would watch black and white TV, especially in the afternoon, or that if they were listening to the radio. Other than that, you really had difficulty getting the word out that these children were missing. However, by about 6 p.m, word definitely got out through word of mouth and people started looking for the children. And in fact, Mr. Beaumont previously worked for Adelaide taxi company, and the call went out to them and they got into their taxis and went around the suburbs of Glenelg and further to see if they could spot the children. But they had just disappeared off the face of the planet.
A deployment of uniformed police came down later that evening, about 30 police officers, uniformed police officers, and it was organised that we do a thorough search of the surrounding area, the beach area, the sandhills, north and south of Glenelg, and all the drains and paddocks and surrounding areas was thoroughly searched. Surveillance was put on the airport and on the interstate rail line in case someone was endeavouring to take them away. All main arterial roads leading out of the state, roadblocks were set up there in case. Unfortunately, there could have been a time lapse of some 6 to 8 hours before the public really became aware of the children were missing, and in that time it gave the offender quite a lot of time to get away.
Was there any sort of, items that they dropped or any sign of them that the police were able to recover?
There was no items that they recovered. There's never been any physical evidence regarding their disappearance. However, as reports started coming in, people were lining up at the police station where Mostyn and the detectives were taking statements from well-meaning public. But that line started to snake quite extensively. And in the police station, they had, would you believe, it's hard to fathom now, they had one phone, one line in, and that ran hot. And the detectives had to do their own typing. They had to type each report. And there was hundreds of them. They were completely inundated. As Mostyn Matters said to me, back when I first interviewed him, he said, we didn't know what we were looking for. We didn't know what had occurred, how this occurred. They just didn't know. They were like everybody else. What happened to the Beaumont children? They were completely inundated. But over the next few days, some credible information came in apart from all the well-meaning public that came in trying to help. With that, there was some really interesting information that came forward. We know when the children alighted from the bus, they walked across to Collie Reserve. Collie Reserve is a beautiful sweeping green lawns that nearly go down to the water's edge. And Glenelg Beach and the others face the Gulf of St Vincent's and Kangaroo Island. that blocks the waves really coming in. So it's dead calm and beautiful to swim at, especially for children. They've laid their towels out near some benches that some people were sitting on. They laid their towels out and they ran down to the water's edge and they played and frolicked in the water, although Grant could not swim, so he was only allowed to go up to his belly button, according to Jane's best friend, who had been to the beach with them several times. They came back and then played under the Collie Reserve sprinklers, which every child did. I did when I was young, and that was usually to get the seawater off you.
The thing that I'd like to impress on you all is that everyone makes sure that they're familiar with the descriptions of the 3 missing children. That is absolutely important. And also make sure your friends are aware of the descriptions of these children. And also, if you have any new Australian friends, perhaps you can assist them in describing the children to them.
And there was a sense that the children had seen a man there. And there were a few witnesses who said they'd sort of been conversing with someone, but it appeared that he wasn't a stranger. Like, it hadn't alerted them. They weren't worried, but they'd sort of been speaking to a man. What were the details about that man that was sort of significant?
I think you hit the nail on the head there, because what we now know, we didn't know in 1966. We can look at this and sort of put yourself in an aerial view and see what had happened. See, those children were very eager to go to the beach. If we can retrace just back, and this would add into what you were saying, they were really eager to go to the beach for a few reasons. It was a stinking hot day. It was one of the last days of the school holidays, but also Arnna and Grant were teasing Jane, saying, Jane's got a boyfriend, Jane's got a boyfriend, and of course it annoyed her. But her mother didn't take much notice of it, so they got on the Worthley's bus, got down to the beach. When they were at the beach, Jane was given some money by her mother to buy pies and some pasties and some drink to bring back for lunch. That was 8 shillings and 6pence in pre-decimal currency, about 85 cents now. However, your spending power back in 1966 was a lot more. That was to buy lunch and bring home for Nancy and the kids to enjoy. Now, she placed that money in her beige clipped purse, and she placed it into a light blue airline-type bag, because it's very important, this information that has been missed for over 50 years. And yet, when we start looking at it differently, we start to realise that maybe this perpetrator lived very close to Collie Reserve. Jane was dressed in her pink one-piece bathers, and she had pale green shorts and canvas sand shoes with white soles. She took with her a paperback copy of Louisa May Alcott's Little Women, and she also carried 3 drying towels, which she placed inside the Airways-type bag. Now, Arnna wore a one-piece red and white striped bather, tan shorts and tan sandals, and she sported a bright orange hairpin in her hair. Now, Grant wore swimming trunks with vertical white stripes under green striped shorts and red sandals. He was not wearing a short. Now, that description, most people know it these days. However, we're going to look at this very differently shortly. Now, the children arrived at Moseley Street, Glenelg. Their bus stop was straight across from the very iconic Wenzel's Bakery, and everybody knew Wenzel's Bakery. It was the place to go and buy your pies and pasties and cakes. And a short walk across to Collie Reserve. There was a few bits of misinformation here. As they were walking across to Collie Reserve, they noticed the postie. Everybody knew their postie back in 1966, and that was Tom Patterson, where Jane called out, "It's the postie, it's the postie." Now, I met Tom Patterson before he passed away back in 2008, and he still remembers that day very vividly. He did initially say to police that he had seen the children in the afternoon, but he was a bit confused because you could imagine, my God, he knew these children so well. He saw them twice a day, 5 days a week. Why twice a day? Because the postie delivered letters twice a day. He later said to the detectives But no, he actually did see them in the morning, and that was around 10 a.m., which works in well when they got off the bus. He spotted them, and then they walked across and placed their towels and so forth. But you're right. You see, the children must have known this man. One, the first thing is Jane's got a boyfriend. What did they mean by that? Now, a boyfriend to a child can be, we're thinking as an adult, but we're not thinking as a child.
It could have been an innocent sort of a conversation she had with a man or a boy at the beach.
And it would indicate that they had met this person previously. There is another reason. They put their towels near the Holdfast Bay Sailing Club, and this was the usual place that they did put their towels according to Jane's best friend. It was their usual spot. But who else was already there? It was the man. Eyewitnesses said the man was lying on the towel near the same, not too far from where the children were, and he was watching them. He watched them come up from the beach and run underneath the sprinklers. So there's two. He was already there. And the boyfriend had been there, obviously, well, it looked like he'd been there previously. This was starting to look like a setup. And this is what predators do. They're grooming. They started playing under the sprinklers. And you're right. They come back and they walk over to him and start jumping over him. Grant Beaumont first started jumping over him and they were laughing, followed by Arnna and then later Jane.
It's interesting too because you were saying that sort of Jane was quite bookish and shy. So the fact that she was speaking to this person at all suggests that there'd been some sort of rapport built.
That surprised Mrs. Beaumont because she had told the children, don't talk to strangers, take care of one another. It was like, you wouldn't go over to this individual if you didn't know him. They don't do that. And Jane, being such a mature girl, and she was quite shy, for her to go over, this is Occam's razor. The simplest solution is usually the best. They knew him. There was Grant flicking him with towels. The man was laughing. The children were laughing. And they went back to play under the sprinklers. This man went over to, and it was only about 10 feet away, over to the bench where he had laid his clothes, which was a shirt, trousers, and he already had the towel. That's all he had. He had no carry bag. He goes over to a couple sitting there and said, this is very chilling, somebody has taken our money. He said, or another couple overheard him and thought he said, somebody has taken some of our money. Whichever it is, their money had been taken. How in the hell did this man know Jane Beaumont had any money? Where was her purse? It was inside her bag. You come to the conclusion very quickly is the man knew because he looked inside Jane's bag. He took her purse. What does he have? He's now got them. He's in control. He is setting this up. They can't leave. He's got them. And he's so nice. He's friendly and he's charming. But also he's very cunning and manipulative. He's manipulating these children without their knowledge. In fact, you could do this to adults and they wouldn't know.
And was there a physical description of him at all? Were these people able to give an approximate age or what he looked like?
The man seen at the beach, he was mid-30s to mid-40s. Some had called him middle-aged. Initially, and this has permeated the media for decades, is that it was a blonde-haired, surfy-type looking guy. It was not. It never was. And I was speaking to Mostyn Matters and also Peter Vogel, who has now passed away. Peter Vogel was also a detective at the Glenelg police station that day. I met them both. They reiterated it was not a long, blonde-headed surfy where his hair was in need of cutting. And if you go onto the internet, you can still read this. It is incorrect. He was mid-30s to mid-40s, middle-aged. He was approximately 6 foot to 6'1", with an athletic build, longish face, high forehead. He was clean-shaven and suntan complexion. The next we have, he has swept-back, light brown, short hair parted to the left side. So he's clean-shaven, he's nicely sun-turned, and he's got nicely combed back, swept back hair. He was wearing light blue bathers with a single white stripe down either side. He only had with him a towel, a shirt and trousers that he placed on the park bench. There was no carry bag.
What sort of a girl is Jane, the 9-year-old? Is she...
Oh, very intelligent, very intelligent. You've only got to tell her a thing once, and she always does what she's told, never to talk to any strangers on the beach. When she swims there, always in groups.
Be quite able to look after the other two?
Oh, quite capable, quite capable.
And so, was that the last sighting of the children? Sort of that when they were playing with this man?
After the man went over to this couple and said their money was stolen, he walked back over to the children. Can you imagine what he said to the children? Our money's been stolen. Now, Jane is smart, but she's only 9 years old. She's not going to say, well, how in the hell did you know I had any money? It was inside my bag. That didn't enter her mind, and neither would it. What are we going to do? Our money's been stolen. So we look at it. He has no money. They have no money. What are we going to do? I tell you what, kids, come with me. I'll be able to get you some money. I just live up there. They happily follow him. He's the Pied Piper. He is setting this up. He is grooming them perfectly. Now, before the children go, he dresses each one of them. Now, the people sitting on the park bench thought this was highly unusual, especially Jane. She's 9 years old. She didn't need anybody dressing. Now, I want you to keep in mind what colours the children were wearing. They follow this man in a northerly direction, away from their bus stop and Wenzel's Bakery where they were last seen. When they wait for him outside the change rooms, from there, they were not seen walking back along Collie Reserve by the eyewitnesses. So what happened? And also, they've got no money. Now, there's a few things. People think that Jane got the pound note, and she was given a pound note. We'll get onto that shortly. She got this pound note that she was seen at Wenzel's Bakery at Collie Reserve. She did not. Very simply, they didn't have any money. So where did they go? Oh, they got into a car. No wallet, no car keys were seen. There was no carry bag. This man travelled very light. If he was out of town, you would have expected that. Well, let's say nobody saw the car keys, but he did have them. He still doesn't have any money. They get in the car, the three children in the back, and then they have to drive to his place. He would have lived at least a suburb away. Now he has to go through the traffic. And then he's got to end up at Wenzel's Bakery. Why? Because they were seen at Wenzel's Bakery within 20 to 25 minutes later, and Wenzel's Bakery, which is just off Jetty Road, which is the main thoroughfare, on Mosley Street across from their bus stop. So he does that. The time blows out, because by the time they left Collie Reserve and ended up at Wenzel's Bakery, the maximum time that had passed was 25 minutes. Now remember, they're walking with Grant Beaumont, 4-year-old, walking at a 4-year-old's pace. The time factor with a car doesn't compute. Even police back in 1966 said it is highly improbable that a car was used, but they weren't thinking. They didn't take it a step forward. Well, if there was no car, the person must have lived within close proximity. Yeah. That never entered anybody's mind, and I don't know why.
Because that would really limit the suspect pool.
Wouldn't it? You hit it on the head.
Yeah.
Wouldn't that limit? What are you looking for? I mean, what would you be looking for if that's the case? What would the police should have been looking for? It's not their fault in 1966, and there's many reasons why. You go, well, we're looking for somebody that fits the description's male, okay, doesn't live too far from Collie Reserve, and he hands out pound notes. Why is the pound note so important? Okay, the guy's not from out of town. He must live close by. They walk to the perpetrator's house. Jane collects the pound note. Wow, a pound note. In 1966, the buying power of a pound note for a child, you could have buckets and buckets and buckets of lollies. That's the way I thought of a pound note. I did see one in my mum's purse, but I'd never, think of taking one. Very noticeable. Remember, your average weekly wage was about £8 a week. That was hard-earned money. Jane got a pound note. A pound equated to wealth. This man was wealthy to easily give to a child that supposedly he hardly knew. Jane walks to the person's house with the children, with Grant in tow. She ends up down at Wenzel's Bakery on Mosley Street, just off Jetty Road. It was very iconic. Everybody knew Wenzel's Bakery. The lady there, her name was Kath. She remembered Jane. She bought 1 pie, 5 pasties, 6 finger buns, 2 large bottles of fizzy drink. That's more than enough for 4. And she paid that with a pound note, which really surprised this lady. Now, this lady is the auntie of Mostyn Matter's wife.
It's all sort of connected, that town in the mid-1960s.
We're all connected.
Yeah.
Everybody knew everybody. Nobody thought anything was afoot except this lady thought, gee, that's unusual. She's paying with a pound note. Now, what didn't Jane have in Wenzel's Bakery? Where was her towels and where was her carry bag?
And so the man didn't accompany her into the bakery. She was just seen on her own or with her siblings?
With the siblings. But he wasn't seen. Now, we could say, well, he was sitting in the car. We ruled out a car. If he gives Jane a pound note, and she's a great girl, she's mature, and he's at his home just up the road, that's it. That's his sort of bait. If she doesn't come back and she keeps it and still walks home, hey, he's lost a pound note. However, if Jane comes back with the lunch, he's on a win-win situation. I know people are going, oh, that's terrible to think. Just put yourself in the shoes of what he's doing and the way he's thinking, not the way we're thinking.
It's Jane's shoes as well, because if she feels indebted to this man and that he's sort of paid when they've lost their money, I can see how you then feel obliged to go back to him and maybe buy him some food.
And what a nice man. Go and buy some fizzy drinks and come back here. It's beautifully set up until they go back to his place. Now, where the perpetrator lives, and we now know that the perpetrator, we believe, is Harry Phipps. Mm-hmm. He lives at the corner of Sussex Street and Augusta Street. Everything happened in a very limited space. Where does Harry Phipps live? He lives straight up Augusta Street. You can see his house from Collie Reserve. It's next to the Anglican Church. And you go, my God, that's close. It is. It's 190 metres in direct sight of Collie Reserve. And if you go at right angles, it's 200 metres to Wenzel's. It is the Bermuda Triangle. I've walked that, and I've walked it very slowly. I even waited where the change rooms were. And I waited there because this is what the kids did. And I walked what I believed as Grant Beaumont's case. I go to Harry Phipps's house, stand out the side, wait, and then I walk to Wenzel's. It took me, at a slow pace, 19 minutes.
The spot where Mr. Patterson last saw the 3 Beaumont children. He was riding his bicycle down Mosley Street, and he saw them standing right where I am. He stopped his bicycle just here. He said hello to them. Then he turned around the corner into Jetty Road and went down towards the post office. Now, the children, after he passed by, the children walked across the road.
Am I right in saying that you were the first person to actually identify this particular suspect?
Yes.
Because that was 2013 in your book, and this man, I believe you didn't name him, but it was, you had a wealth of evidence that this person was responsible. What was the other evidence that you had about Harry Phipps?
Oh, where do we start? Alan Whitaker, I've known since university days, the University of Western Sydney, back in the late 1980s. I've known him since then. He was teaching for a while, and then he got into authoring books with New Holland Publishing. And he had just finished his first true crime book, The Wanda Beach Murders, where 2 teenage girls were raped and murdered in the sand dunes on Wanda Beach, which is just down south of Cronulla, not too far from Sydney. It doesn't really interest me only because I'm not New South Welshman, I'm South Australian. As much as the Beaumont Children's story wasn't of great interest to him because his heart's in New South Wales. However, he sent me the book, which he usually did when he did books. He'd send them to me and a few friends from university days. I called him back and said, mate, if you ever get a chance to do the Beaumont Children, I'm in. And he said, oh, that's right, you were born there. I said, I was born in Glenelg. I would like to know what happened to the children. Alan called me a week later and said, you would not believe this. My publishers just asked me, can I do a book on the Beaumont Children? And he said, are you in? And I said, absolutely. So we went off down to Glenelg, and Alan did most of the research because he was employed by the publishers, and I helped him. I showed him the lay of the land in Glenelg and where I lived and where the Beaumonts lived, and it was very easy to get around. I knew those suburbs. Now, at that time, the head of major crime, who we met, was not really forthcoming. Oh, what are you after? Notoriety, you're after publicity. He said plenty of books have been written about the Beaumont Children. We said nothing's been written about the Beaumont Children. Oh, what good is that going to do? If you write a book, people read it, of course, and they come out and say, listen, I might know this, I might know that. This did happen with the book. Alan got, I feel for him, he got most of it. He called me, I remember this. He said, you know what? A guy came to my place and knocked on the door, and he was adamant that the Beaumont Children were living in Western Australia, and he wanted me to go and follow that up. I said, I feel for you.
Oh, my God.
He received calls with theories. Look, this is what the police have to put up with. Have you ever thought of looking into, Bill blogs or whatever? And look, I've had these calls, and you say, well, you look into them.
Yeah.
Why do I have to look into them? Oh, well, I don't have the time. Well, why would I have the time? I said, just go to the police. I did, I said. And what did they say? They're not interested. I wonder why.
So was there any sort of credible evidence that came out of it?
Yeah, there was. There was one call. Alan called me and he said, mate, are you sitting down? Every now and then you get that chill that goes up your spine or down your spine. This was one moment. He said, mate, I've just had this lady call. Her name is Angela Fife. And she lives up near you, so you might be able to see it. She said she's read the book and there was a few things she didn't know about the story. One, that Jane was given a pound note, and the actual description of the man. Angela said, I was married to a guy called Hayden Phipps. I'm not married to him anymore. And we did live in South Australia, and then we lived up in Queensland. He said to me one night when he was watching a documentary on the Beaumont Children, he turned to Angela and said, I think my father had something to do with that. Now, that sent shudders down her spine because she worked at the correctional centres and she was dealing with the sexually abused. She had classes for the sexually abused prisoners, and a lot of people that have been sexually abused, especially males, end up in prison for a myriad of other reasons associated with their sexual abuse. She had inklings that her husband, Hayden, had been sexually abused by his father, who was Harry Phipps. And she called Alan. Alan called me, and because she lived in Queensland, I set up a time to meet her, which she was quite happy to do so. And she was only about 2 hours up the road. Now, in my job, I've got my own company for the last 20 years. And I think this is important, is that I do recruitment for senior hospitality worldwide. And I have to be very thorough in my research, especially when I'm placing somebody for $300,000 or $400,000. If I don't thoroughly research this individual and do reference checks on them very thoroughly, I won't have this client anymore. So I'm going to make sure that I'm very thorough. With Angela, the first thing I needed to do was to meet her. I'm not doing anything over the phone. I was happy to meet her. She was happy to meet me. I found her amazingly credible. And I asked her, I'm going to have to do reference checks on you. And she said, by all means, call the head of the correctional facilities here or there. I will tell them that you're calling. What she did say that I didn't know about the pound note. Harry Phipps, Hayden's father, was known to hand out pound notes. He was a very wealthy, very respected, charming, very well-connected individual. He ran his own company called Castelloy, which is at North Plympton. They made Harley-Davidson rims for the motorbikes. They made parts for Holden, Ford, and later on with Nissan and Mitsubishi. So he was very wealthy, and he always carried a wad of cash.
Wow.
And she said, I know that he gave out pound notes. I said, what about the description? Because really, excuse me, this is not politically correct. If he was short, fat and squat, that's it. That rules him out. But he wasn't. She said, look, I didn't know him back in the 60s, but he was around 6 foot tall. I know back in the 60s he had light brushed back hair, and he still does, and that he was a regular swimmer. She said, I know that. And I believe that he did sexually abuse his own son. And I thought, well, God, we've got somebody that fits the description, hands out pound notes, and looks like he's an alleged pedophile. You go, oh, wow.
Were you able to get in contact with the son?
Yes. Now, because he had been or allegedly sexually abused, you can imagine a lot of sexually abused people do not want to meet. They do not want to talk about their abuse, and this is in the high percentages. And I know some people said, oh, if he was abused, he would have told me. He would have. No, they don't. Some commit suicide. They suffer from severe depression. They have anxiety. Alcoholism, drug abuse, self-harm. They have all that. So it's not so easy to go in and meet them. With Angela, she hadn't been in contact with Hayden. It was too difficult. His moods would swing, and she didn't want anything more to do with him. However, she gave me the number of Hayden's son. I sent the book, Searching for the Beaumont Children. I had his address, though, Hayden's address, and I sent the book by registered mail to the post office. And I just said in there, my name is Stuart Mullins. I'd like to talk to you about somebody. Would you mind giving me a call? I never heard from him. With his son, I sent the same thing. I found his address, and he called. And he lived up in Broadbeach, which was just up from in Queensland. So, and Hayden lived at also Broadbeach. So I thought, well, they're very close. Anyway, the son called me. Now, I didn't say anything in this book. I just said I'd like to talk to you about something. He called and he introduced himself. He said, mate, I know what this has to do with. It's to do with my dad, grandfather, and the Beaumont Children, obviously, because he got the book.
Yeah.
And I believe my grandfather was involved. I thought, oh, you didn't know. How did you know I was going to talk about this? And he said, mate, I know when I get this. My father always said that his father, Harry, had something to do with the case. Anyway, I went around to meet the son. He played to me a recording. He recorded his father when he went around, and all he didn't say anything. He just handed his father, Hayden, the book, because Hayden hadn't been to the post office, so he didn't receive it. He recorded, I listened to this recording. Hayden's first words were, oh, my God, I knew this day would come. What do we do? What do we do? We've got to go to the police. Now, that is a very unusual response if you don't think there's anything untoward. The son was telling me, he said, I believe my father was sexually abused over many years, that Harry Phipps had a Saturn fetish. I saw this Saturn, and when he was around Saturn, he became sexually aroused. And I thought, oh, God. And this is living, 190 metres in direct sight of Collie Reserve? I had to keep going.
This interview relates to IFB file 080595WN between Bill Hayes and Hayden, Haydn Phipps. Hayden, as you're aware, I've been asked to speak to you in relation to certain matters involving the disappearance of the Beaumont children. Do you understand what we're going to talk about?
Yes, I do.
Well, did you see them talking to Harry?
Yeah. I saw them coming into the backyard from the country house. They came to Dad's car. I think they were inside the house, and that's it.
Did you hear what they're saying?
No, it's too far away.
Had there been any sightings or anything? Had there been anything for Hayden that sort of solidified to him, my father was the man who did this?
Very good question. Very good question. I did get to meet Hayden, and I spent a few hours with him, and he was getting it all off his chest. But there was a few things he said. I met him at his Broadbeach unit. I started to chat with him, made him feel comfortable. But the story was that, yes, he was sexually abused in his words, and I don't believe he's lying. And in fact, to your listeners, they're going, so, well, he could be lying. Studies have found that less than 5% of allegations of child sexual abuse brought by the children are fictitious. There is a 95% chance that Hayden Phipps is telling the truth. You know what? If I'm a betting man on the horses and my horse has got a 95% chance of winning, I think I'm going to put my money on that one.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, Hayden, I remember him banging down his hand on the armchair and he said, mate, I swear I saw these children in my backyard that day. And I said, well, how do you know they were the Beaumont children? He said, mate, it was around lunchtime. They came into the backyard around lunchtime. Now, that's a lucky guess. Look at the timing of Collie Reserve when they left. And I said, well, how would you know? He said, well, initially I thought they were all boys. And I thought, well, that's a bit strange. He said, the haircuts are all the same. I tell you what, have a look at the photo.
Yeah.
They are. And I was like, mate, your memory's incredible, because when you have something called traumatic that you experience, you remember it for the rest of your life. And I said, okay, well, what apart? He said, look, I don't remember much about what they're wearing. I do remember the oldest girl and the way he was thinking. And I was looking at him, I thought, my God, you're telling the truth. She had a sort of bag, a sort of bag. And I said, what kind of bag? He's like, I just know she had a bag with her. She did. If he's lying, he's going to go into a lot of detail. Oh, yeah, and they extrapolate the story.
Yes.
And then they've got to have a good memory. Now, if you lie, you've got to have a good memory.
Yes.
So that's where you pick them up. And I thought, geez, this is good. He went on to talk about his dad's satin fetish, that he couldn't stop making satin dresses. I asked him, I said, well, what colour? What colours? And he said, oh, God, lime green, pink was his favourite, red and orange and purple. Have a look at the first few colours and have a look at and if you go back to what the children were wearing at the beach.
Wow.
This was a bee to a honey pot.
What do you think happened to the Beaumont children that day?
They followed him. They walked to his house. Hayden said he saw them come in the backyard. The back door was open. He said they went into the back door. Dad came out later, put 4 sort of surf-type bags in the back of the car and drove off. Now, his timing or his timeline could be a little wonky. Mm-hmm. He saw the children and he saw the father. If they followed him, that would be correct. They would have come in around lunchtime, so Hayden's correct. They go inside. Harry gives them the £1 note. They walk out the front door because Hayden said they didn't come out the back. And again, if that's lying, that story would change over a few years, and it never did. Yeah. The children walk out the front. Now, that front of his house, the front door looks straight down Sussex Street to Jetty Road. And if you hit Jetty Road and you turn just a fraction right and then left, you're at Wenzel's Bakery. It fits like a glove. Now, what happened from Wenzel's Bakery, we don't know. We know that Harry Phipps drove off in the car. Now, he had a Cadillac with fins. It was very noticeable. Went, and from there, we don't know.
Have you got a sense of where if they were murdered, where their bodies might lie?
The bodies are at Cast Alloy Factory.
And why do you believe that?
There's been 2 digs there at the back of the factory. When Bill Hayes, I hired Bill Hayes because I wasn't getting anywhere with the police. In fact, I was told, I'm beating my head up against a brick wall. This is very early on. I'm beating my head up against the brick wall and I'm chasing my tail. I was told that by the detective. Mm-hmm. Even though there was mounting circumstantial evidence, I was told that. However, it doesn't take a detective to deter me. And I didn't, and I'll be honest with you, I'd done reference checks on him. I'd done 5, and they were interesting, put it that way. So I hired Bill Hayes, and he recorded the conversation and sent it to Australia's best lie detection expert, which is Steve Van Apron, and I also sent it to Holland, to statement analysis experts. They didn't know each other. They sent back their findings and said, Hayden Phipps is telling the truth but hiding more. They were nearly identical. There was a whole lot. One in particular was when Hayden said to Bill Hayes, they came into the car. Both statement analysis experts, as most probably your listeners will pick up, what do you mean they came into the car? They got into the car if you were standing outside.
Yeah, so true.
They came into the car if you're in the car. And this is why Hayden only goes so far and won't say any more. At the end of the conversation with Bill Hayes, Bill was helping him in the car. He was really he was knackered, excuse the expression, but he was knackered. He was tired. He had spoken about his sexual abuse again, and that takes a lot out of him. As he was getting into his car, he looked up to Bill. Now, Bill was 12 years as a detective, and he was several years in major crime in South Australia. He looked up at Bill and said, Bill, they're in the sandpit. Bill called me. He said, mate, I've been a detective. I was in the federal police. I was a soldier with the British Armed Services and the Special Forces. And he said, this guy is telling the truth. These children are in the sandpit. The sandpit is at Castelloy. When the police did the first dig, and they did, which we were very grateful for, Hayden Phipps called his cousin, who called me, and he said, mate, they're digging in the fucking wrong spot. And I said to Peter, how does he know? That's his cousin. How does he know? He said, he must have been there. He has mentioned the sandpit to his son, to me, to Bill, to his wife, to his cousin. 5 separate occasions. The one to Bill was the one that really startled. They are there. We were just digging in the wrong spot. The sandpit, in his recorded interview that's been analysed, the sandpit he's talking about is in front of the 2 workmen's cottage at Castelloy. If you can look at an aerial view, you'll get that on Google, by the way, or you get it on my website, you can see where the 2 cottages are. Now, the 2 cottages are very important to this case. So in front of those, I checked with some workers from the Castelloy factory from the 1950s and 1960s. There was a sandpit in front of those cottages, and as they filled it up with metal filings, they would move the sandpit further up the factory to the end of the back gate. So it kept moving. They'd fill it in over a period of time with sand. It was beautiful sand, like beach sand, and then they would move towards the back of the factory.
That's so interesting. I just hope that one day they are recovered. And earlier this month, Nancy Beaumont passed away, not knowing what happened to her children. And I just hope
that... Yeah, she did.
Yeah.
You hit it right on the head, the not knowing.
Yeah.
She was living a nightmare for 52 years.
And I think
now she's with her children.
You know, it's a case that changed Australia, and to have a conclusion and to perhaps one day actually recover those bodies would mean an awful lot to a lot of people. So thank you so much for all the hard work you're doing on this case, and it's something that I think will, stay in the public mind and our curiosity until it is solved. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Jim, what sort of questions does one ask on a time like this?
Well, what can you say, actually? I mean, I know many people all over Australia really feel for us. Well, what can you say at this moment? I mean, we've been hanging on for 9 months and 14 days now, and just wait and hope and pray.
I suppose there's been several false alarms over these past harrowing 9 months for you.
Oh, yes, it raises our hopes, and we're let down again. And by the way, I would like to say at this stage that I will thank all the radio, television stations and the press for what they have been doing. I mean, they are... I mean, I know everybody feels for us, but all over Australia. But,
well, thank you very much.
Stuart's book, The Saturn Man, Uncovering the Mystery of the Missing Beaumont Children, is available at all good bookstores and online. We'll keep you updated on the release of his new book about the case. For photos, maps, and extra reading on the Beaumont Children, don't forget to join our closed Facebook group. Just search True Crime Conversations on Facebook. You can also contact the show by emailing truecrime@mamamia.com.au. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast hosted by me, Jessie Stevens, and produced by Elise Cooper.